Right, it is the top of the hour, so I'm going to get going here. So welcome everybody to our March panel series. My name is Carson McPherson-Kretzky, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Hazard and Climate Resilience Institute. I'm excited today to be talking about making data and information actionable for communities and decision makers. It's a topic that I'm really excited about and passionate about, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with our panelists here today. We're also co-sponsoring this event with the Idaho Prescribed Fire Council. So we're excited to be doing that, and it'll be co-facilitated as well with my friend and colleague, Brett Miller. So before we get going, I wanted to go over some of the goals of these panels in general. We've had monthly panels throughout the school semester and year so far, and the goals of these panels are really to connect across disciplines and sectors, to learn about ongoing community resilience projects and organizations that are happening here in Idaho and elsewhere, to find out how university researchers and students can support local efforts and information needs. And then finally, and importantly, to consider what actions we all can take moving forward to build community resilience, and then start taking steps to do them. So I like to start by giving our definition of community resilience, which is the capacity of a community or region to adapt to change and thrive despite the chronic stresses such as access to resources or climate change and acute shocks like flooding or wildfire that they may experience. So when we're thinking about resilience in these various contexts for each of these different panels, we're kind of coming back to the same definition. And today we're really focused on trying to talk about how we make information and data useful for communities or people or decision makers. And I think as a community of researchers and students who are often creating data and creating information, I think this is a really important topic to be focusing on right now. I know during the COVID pandemic, we've seen that more information doesn't always lead to action. And so I think that's true in a lot of other areas, whether it's information around climate change or natural hazards or whatever it may be. So I'm really excited to hear more from our panelists. But first, I want to let our co-facilitator introduce himself. So go ahead, Brett, and talk a little bit about yourself, and then we will go ahead and introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Carson. Yeah, we're really excited. This is we're really excited to be finally having this panel. Carson and I have been talking about this for a while, and this is something that's this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as well. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Montana on the co-management of fire risk transmission project, which is a Forest Service funded research project, but I actually live here in Boise. And so when I learned about HCRI, I was really excited to get involved, and I am, really excited to be able to bring the work that I do professionally together with the place that I live and love. And I'm also, as Carson mentioned, the outreach coordinator for the Idaho Prescribed Fire Council, which is how we got a couple of our participants for this panel today. So you'll see a little bit of a theme there. But that's enough about me. Let's, I think the important thing is to let the panel introduce themselves. So let's just start. Mark, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go left to right.
You bet. Thanks for having me. Welcome everybody. I'm Mark Boyle. I am, well, as you see there, Smoke Management Program Supervisor for the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. I've been with the agency for coming up on 27 years now. So my perspective today about data and sharing that with communities is going to come from a time when I started working, we didn't even have internet access. So it was very difficult to get timely data to communities. So a lot of interesting stuff I've seen occur over the years. I'm looking forward to sharing today.
Thanks, Mark. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Brett. I'm Steve Hubble. I'm the Climate Action Manager for the City of Boise. Our team here works directly on the city's climate action, clean energy, sustainability, and air quality programs. And then we support numerous aspects of other city operations that relate back to climate. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks, Steve. Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Russell, and I'm the Prevention, Education, and Outreach Specialist for the Idaho Department of Lands. I'm also a Fire Type 2 PIO, so that's a Public Information Officer. So I do use data quite a bit to talk with the public about and around fire issues, and especially during crisis. And I'm really excited to be here on this panel. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Jen. And finally, Matt, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I'm Matt Erpelding. I'm the Government Affairs Director for Micron Technology. And previously, I was a state representative in the Idaho legislature representing the downtown Boise district. And this is an interesting discussion to me because Micron specializes in making semiconductors that store data, both permanently and for the use of algorithms and short-term data. But then in addition to that, having come from the political world, how we interpret data and then put it into action, I think is a big piece of determining how resilient a community is. And I think it's best described by how folks have, on such a divergent level, interpreted the data around the pandemic. So I look forward to today's conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And you did all introduce yourself, obviously, but the first thing we want to do, our first question is we want to give everyone an opportunity on the panel to describe your position in a little bit more detail and specifically talk about what kinds of information you or your organization use or communicate on a regular basis. We got to know where each of you work and what your position is, but if you could just talk a little bit more about what kind of data you use and how you use it. And I'm just going to open this up to the whole panel. So if anyone wants to jump in, go ahead. But if not, I'm more than willing to start calling on people.
I think we're all so polite. We want somebody else to go first.
Right? Well, I guess I'll jump in and go first as I'm the talker here in the bunch. But as a fire prevention officer, I use data quite a bit in that I look at weather data. I look at historical fire data. I look at numbers of burn permits we have, human caused fires versus lightning caused fires. I look at demographics and where people are living in the state of Idaho, and I try to triangulate how best we can serve the citizens of Idaho with information about fire and how to reduce human caused fire on the landscape, and how we can live in a fire adapted community at the same time, knowing that fire is a part of the natural regime of where we live. And I will hand it over to Mark.
Okay. Well, I guess that's a good segue because I was going to hit up all the smoke management pieces of those fires that you're referencing. So my agency is kind of dispersed throughout the state. I kind of oversee the program. So when I say DEQ or I do this, I'm going to really be referencing maybe 6 or 12 individuals that implement programs throughout the state of Idaho in our regional offices. So as far as wildfire smoke goes, we definitely use weather models, air quality information for sure, quite extensively, but then also, hitting up Jennifer and her cohorts about wildfire activity and where is it located and how crazy is it. So using that kind of information to get out to the public daily basis, and we partner with our health regional health departments to also provide that information to the public. Boy, what else? So we're also dealing with agricultural burning, which a whole different kind of beast, but the weather is still, the main driver of some of those decision-making processes that we have. I'll bring up later probably the differences of fuels and the gaps or whatnot. But that's one of the things that we're kind of really struggling with on forecasting wildfire smoke or prescribed fire smoke, is that difference in that or the unknown of the fuel condition, I guess I would say. So it's pretty widespread.
I can jump in next, Brett. Certainly the city, with a really broad range of operations, we use a multitude of different data sources and do a number of different data analyses that we could probably spend the whole time talking about just those. But focusing in on the work of our climate action team, one of the key products that we develop is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for both the city or community of Boise, and then for our city-owned and operated facilities. The data sources that we pull from that come from a variety of different sources. These are things like energy utility usage information from our electricity and natural gas providers, water use data from our water provider. We utilize transportation data that we access from Compass, or a regional planning agency. And we take that data and synthesize it and then generate it into an output to show annual greenhouse gas emissions for the community. And then we monitor what's happening with over time, whether it's increasing, whether it's decreasing. Obviously, our plans support work to show decreases there, but we're also balancing that with tremendous growth in the region, which is kind of a challenging predicament that we have there. Kind of another example of a recent project was we have developed a baseline condition assessment at the neighborhood scale of various aspects of environmental justice, community health, and equity across Boise. And that'll help us with some of our planning and deployment of our climate action programs and potentially other city programs to try to get those programs and resources to portions of the city that might have opportunities for improvement as compared to others, or may have seen more challenges in those areas historically. In addition to that, I'll just touch generally our department, Public Works. We produce a lot of data on water quality. We operate 2 wastewater facilities that discharge to the Boise River, and so there's a number of water quality data that's associated with that. We also utilize air quality data provided by Mark's team from DEQ in our operations. And then I think one that's worth mentioning, not that I have personal involvement in, but we've done wastewater testing for the markers of COVID over the last year and a half to 2 years, which I know is something I've been personally interested in. And I know the city's really proud of that work, and it's supported some of our response to the pandemic there.
You know, I'm going to speak about it from Micron's perspective. I may touch on it from a political lens as well, but how we use data at Micron is much like the other 3 have already really spoken to. We try to get as objective a view of what the facts on the ground are, whether it's relation to how we can increase our water reuse in our systems, how we can decrease our air emissions as a function of that, how we can secure power that's going to be more renewable and better for the environment in the long haul. And all of those things, if you think about it, also drive capital expenditures and in many cases do lower our operating costs. So we look for those data points that show that there's a correlation between making beneficial improvements in our systems, which happen to also increase our environmental footprint or decrease our environmental footprint. But we're also looking at it from the perspective of, how can we do this and also still remain a financially, successful company. The other piece is, if I just use COVID as an example, Micron has followed the science as closely as possible throughout the pandemic. As a result, many of our employees haven't been on site for nearly 2 years. We wear masks, we test on a weekly basis, and a lot of that is counter to the kind of public mantra around how we view the pandemic, but also how the public in Idaho sometimes views climate change, or at least our politicians view climate change and the importance of it. But even as far as just recently out of the legislature, there was a resolution that was passed that went directly after what are called ESGs at the corporate level. And ESGs are environmental, social, and governance. These are the goals the companies set, and those goals include diversity, equity, inclusion. They focus on decreasing our environmental footprint, decreasing our carbon output, all things that from a traditional perspective you would think is a no-brainer, but they've been wrapped into a perception of some grand conspiracy theory that is changing the world. The other thing I want to point out is all of this data that we're talking about cannot really be effectively accessed without the power of computing. And the power of computing requires semiconductors. And those semiconductors, whether it's DRAM for short-term memory and large-scale data holding, a logic chip, which is really the algorithm that processes it, or NAND, which is long-term memory like you would find in an SSD drive, semiconductors use chemicals from a global supply chain. And you have to have a strong global supply chain in order to be able to access this data on a regular basis. And so we talk about community resiliency and accessing data, but you can't really access the data unless you have a resilient global supply chain that provides all of the different chemical makeups, minerals, and other things that are necessary for semiconductors. Otherwise, you would have all of the data in 5,000 pages of paper, and you would have to go through and compute it yourself, which is quite difficult. So this whole process is really interesting to me because we do not exist in isolation. Our communities have so much overlap between what's happening at the global environment, whether it's conflict with Ukraine and Russia, which has disrupted the neon supply chain. Russia is the sole supplier of many rare earth minerals. And then when you talk about the Taiwan, China, Pacific Rim complications, we have a lot to think about when we talk about accessing data on a more global scale as well.
Well, great. Thank you all for that response. And Matt, I'm going to riff on a couple of things you said. I want to come back to a point you made about, data and public perception and controversy. But first, I kind of want to explore that second thing you just brought up and take it in. I'll kind of use it for my, I have a question here that I want to ask, and it really segues very nicely into it, but you're kind of alluding to something we really want to hear about, which is where do each of you see potential gaps in, between the information and tools that are available and what decision makers and communities need? And you can think about that question in terms of decision makers and communities as being different, or maybe, there's overlap there. I want to invite you to explore that however you want, but you were sort of talking about one potential gap there, Matt, and I want to hear if there are any other gaps that you see. I mean, is it the lack of data, or is there something else that's a barrier? And I want to open that up to the whole panel as well.
I'm happy to start. I do not think there's a lack of data. I think the data is present to everyone. And in psychology, it's called sensation and perception psychology. So the data is the objective information that's coming in. And then what is kicked out is the perception. So whatever lens somebody interprets that through. The single best example of that is the way that data is then spun into news/propaganda based on a specific agenda. So we're not, especially in areas where you have what would be considered a media desert. And there are parts of Idaho where the only media they have access to is the Salt Lake media market, or in North Idaho where the only access they have is the Washington media market. And so there's a real challenge in getting Idaho specific information into areas around this state that is both accurate and objective. It's much easier to get an opinion piece in a newspaper focused on your issue than it is to get a reporter who's often strapped, often underpaid, and often under-resourced to do the digging that's necessary to get an objective report out in the newspaper. And you see that in Boise, which is a media-rich environment, but you see it on a much more exaggerated scale. The further rural, the further you go into Idaho and enter into rural communities where there's large media deserts. I think the other challenge that we have with getting data out to the public in a way that is objective, or I guess I should say, I don't actually think that anything is truly objective, but by minimizing subjectivity as much as possible. But we're all going to bring some level of subjectivity to the table, regardless of whether we intended to or not. And getting that information out to the public and helping educate them without coming across as A, a mansplainer, or B, a condescending, intellectual is tough. And so the the question is, how do we distribute that information in an environment that is so diffuse in terms of access to media resources? And it is not working very well currently.
Thank you, Matt. Jen, I kind of want to call on you to follow up on that, because I know that you think about this, task of disseminating information to the public and how to translate that successfully.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I think though, there's two different ways in which I communicate with the public, because there's messaging on how we would like the public to behave. And then there's messaging that I work with when I do crisis communication and trying to get information in a crisis situation out to the public. And those are two different worlds that I think bear, me explaining that from the beginning. And so I can answer that question from the standpoint of messaging on how we want to change behavior and or support proper behaviors. For example, how to burn your slash properly, or how to minimize your risk to starting a wildfire by properly installing your chains on your trailer, and behaviors that support living in a fire adapted community and understanding how fire can be a part of that. I think there's a lot of data that can support our efforts and our messaging to explain why we do what we do. And I think the hitch is where how do we, and it's not manipulative or packaging, but how do we say that to the average person so we don't sound exactly like what Matt said? I don't want to come off as the know-it-all condescending person telling somebody, no, you can't do this. But I also don't want them to go along thinking that, oh yeah, I know fire, I can do whatever I want, I've been living here forever. Because there are some things that have changed across, the landscape, meaning we've got different people from different areas here now. We've also got a drier environment to deal with. It hasn't always been this warm, this early, this dry, this early. And in a time when resources are at a minimum, preventing wildfire is a huge thing, because the state of Idaho does not burn at the same time that all the rest of our surrounding states burn. And when all of the resources are in our surrounding neighboring states, there's nobody to come for us, though the cavalry can never be called. So we have to do what we can to prevent. So my big, banner is that I can communicate to the public so that they get that without me looking like that, crazy lady screaming, don't prevent fires, it's going to burn, we're all going to die, in a way that they can take that. So I'm kind of taking the science aspect and then talking to the people aspect. And that's that little, sweet spot that we all can get on board with. Does that make sense? Did I kind of back that up?
No, that's great. Thank you, Jen.
Absolutely.
I don't want to, Mark and Steve, I don't want to preclude you from talking about communicating data to the public if you want to follow up to this. But just in the interest of time, I also want to invite both of you to maybe think a little bit about this question in terms of what do you see as the gaps for the information that's available on the back end and the decisions that you need to make in your positions? Because I think that Matt and Jen have, what they've contributed is really helpful. And if you want to add to that, but I'm also curious about, behind the curtain, what's going on there in terms of the data and tools that are available and the decisions that have to be made even before they're being communicated to the public. And what do you see as gaps there?
What I was thinking, what brought to mind when they were talking is our agricultural burning program, say. So we can have a really neat packaged information for people like communities to say, well, here's what we do to make a burn decision and, provide some support for crop residue burning. And we only burn when the wind is at a certain angle or a certain speed, or you get lift, or fuel moisture is a certain. And then, we do that so we can avoid smoke impacts. Well, what happens right after we issue that message? Something goes wrong and we get smoke impacts on the ground. We lose our credibility. So it seems like we're missing this. The data gap I'm looking at is it's just the understanding. We have the information. It's getting that kind of a big understanding into people, and then hitting with those little dots of the points of information that people need to hear to remind them to do something, or remind them that we're doing this to protect the environment, but things aren't perfect. I think that's the hard part, is getting that big slug of information to people so they really see the full picture. So when something does go wrong, you don't lose your credibility right out of the gate. They understand the big picture.
Brett, I can just add quickly, I think the challenge we have, or the gap in data, is geographic specificity. We're often starting to look for data at a pretty micro scale. And in a lot of circumstances, we're only able to access data at sort of a citywide geographic scale, or maybe slightly smaller. An example of that would be energy use information. We would like to find ways to target some of our programming to people in portions of the city that may be using more energy than others. But right now, some of the constraints on data accessibility prevent us from kind of digging down to those levels. So that's probably what I would point out.
That's great, Steve. I wanted to follow up on that because actually my next question was going to be something along the lines of, I'm hearing a lot that there's a lot of difficulty in terms of explaining the data or translating the data, or sort of, understanding the potential limitations of the data. But then you brought something up, Steve, about data accessibility. And I would invite you to talk a little bit more about that. And if anyone wants to, to follow up, but, what do you see as the data accessibility situation for the public, and how do you see data accessibility and community resilience? What is the relationship there? How is that impacting community resilience from your perspective? I'm going to direct that at Steve, and then invite anyone who wants to follow up on that.
Brett, I think in terms of the first part, the accessibility discussion, we pump a lot of information out from the city. And one of the things we discuss often is just the capacity of the public to absorb the amount of information that we're pushing out, much less what they're getting from any other government agency or the private sector, media, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something we think about a lot in terms of just access and being mindful in the level and amount of information that we share. Tying back to community resilience, obviously that's a pretty significant tie to my work. As I was kind of thinking about the discussion today, I really thought about it from an emergency management perspective, kind of historically thinking about data availability on things like flood risk or fire risk, and making that information out available to the public so that they can be aware and prepare for that. And now I think we've got to transition that resilience discussion around climate risk, which certainly more sometimes from a day-to-day or a local or regional impact can be a bit more abstract, particularly often when kind of the global impacts of climate change tend to be used. I think, we are starting to see fire increase, impacts to air quality, obviously drought recently. So I think that drives home more the local impacts and the resilience considerations that we need to think about perhaps than we would have, say, a few years ago.
I was muted. Thank you, Steve. If anyone wants to follow up on that, go ahead. If not, I'm going to actually turn it over to Carson to finish out the rest of our questions. Thank you so much for answering mine.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett. Yeah, and I think all of your responses have been just so interesting to think about. Yeah, so I wanted to kind of follow up with, all right, so if we're talking about some of these challenges that we're facing around data accessibility, or having so much information, but not necessarily knowing how to translate that into action, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how we do translate information into action, or in reality, how that's not happening. I know in our pre-meeting, Matt, you had some interesting comments on some of the realities in terms of like a policy space of information maybe not being used for decision making. So I'd love to hear from you, and also from Jen on this.
Well, I will tell you, I don't remember what I said before, so I'm just going to go for it. No, I don't think that the scientific community and the political community or political leadership have done the work to be able to engage with one another and talk on the same level. And what I mean by that is scientists, I think really good scientists, which I'm sure you all are, take all the information they have, they pump it into their system, they figure it out, they measure, they assess it, and they hope to come up with a quantitative meaning that they can show and they can demonstrate and they can repeat all of the things that go along with doing research. What they don't consider is how that will then be messaged to the public and how the different channels message things differently. And so what you often produce is incredible information that is valuable when viewed through an objective lens, and then they turn around and it's weaponized. It's either weaponized by the left because they will signal that the sky is falling. Incidentally, I'm a Democrat, so I can say that about my own side. They will weaponize it and make it into the sky is falling. And on the other side, they'll bury their heads in the sand and be deniers of it. That's not really happening. This happened ages ago when we didn't have any information. I mean, all the things that are out there. So what you end up with is scientific information that gets turned into propaganda and weaponized at the political level. I think the only solution to that, honestly, is to have a very coordinated strategy for building relationships with political leaders to a place where they trust you. And that's how you make impact in the political environment, when they call the scientists that they trust, and that happens to be you or a member of your team. And we really don't have a solid external communications or public affairs approach for our scientific community, because we're focused on the intellectual side and we're focused on the academic side. And so like Steve at the city has, the city has a very strong government affairs team. They've got a public affairs team and a community engagement team. So that's a little bit different. But when we talk about specifically academia and how they could better integrate with politics, it would be to really devise a public affairs strategy that starts with building solid relationships with legislators who you might not have anything in common with.
Thank you, Matt. I think that's a great answer, and I have lots of other questions, but I'm going to let maybe Jen or other folks respond to that as well.
I really liked what Matt had to say. I thought it was pretty spot on, in that I had notes to myself about this in your questions, that there isn't a lack of information. It's that space in between the scientist who makes this really cool outcome and this person who's working in practicing those outcomes. And so there's sometimes a disparity between the folks doing the research and the folks putting stuff on boots on the ground. And so I think that there's that link in having opportunities like this one right here help us put the practitioner with the academic and make those relationships, like Matt said, because that's where it all happens, where you get that interpretation space to help bridge those gaps and build the trust and build the relationships. It looked like Mark was going to say something, so I don't want to hog all the time.
I guess I was going back to the community aspect of it, and getting involved in community to produce this dialogue that kind of digs underneath all of that garbage that we get sent, on our phones every day. And then what popped up in my head is like, well, if I'm working on the smoke management plan, we want to only burn on good days. Let's say that's one of our goals. Let's burn on a day when smoke's going to disperse well. Well, what's that look like? Give me a number. Can I do a ventilation number? Well, if you pigeonhole yourself with just an easy decision to say, well, 500 of a clearing index, yeah, that works great. That's going to be great, but it's really going to hamper you, moving forward. So you got to have this big background understanding about what it is you're trying to achieve and what looks like a good burn day, so that people can start understanding that themselves, rather than, well, the government said it's a 500 and it's a 490 today, so I'm not burning. But in my area, it could have been perfect. Our models don't get down to that granular, every single watershed or drainage, that's going to be a little bit different in Idaho. It's just things don't work that way. But yeah, it's getting into communities and it's having those relationships and those conversations that's just so critical.
Thanks, Mark. Steve, I'd love to hear a little bit from you as well. I know that project that you mentioned where you have kind of this baseline of information that's now starting to bring more equity into the other hazard data and other kinds of information. Can you talk about some of the kind of steps you're taking with that data and examples of how it's actually getting used to make some decisions, or some of the barriers you're facing in putting that information out?
Carson, I think I'll speak to the barriers first. We have just to build that out a little bit. We've done a heat mapping essentially of neighborhoods across the city that faced historically greater challenges around environmental justice, equity, and community health. And it's data driven. It's pulled from a number of different acceptable data sources, but I think one of the big challenges around that is not having it turn into a my neighborhood's better than your neighborhood type of thing, because that's certainly not our intent from doing it. So I think we've been very guarded and careful in kind of releasing the information out there. And then Carson, to your second question, making sure that release is accompanied by how we're going to use the information and what we see as potential outcomes. And we're still relatively early on in the process. So I think I'll just touch that lightly and likely an opportunity for follow-up maybe at a future session.
Yeah, no, thank you. All right, well, we've touched on this a little bit, but I think because oftentimes our listeners here are in academia, and I think a lot of the points that folks have made already have been really helpful. But for those academic audiences, from the practitioner view, what do you see as some of the best practices for researchers who want to create helpful information, want their information to get out there? Maybe apart from developing more trusted relationships, I think that's kind of a key first step. But I'd be curious to hear what are some other recommendations that you have for researchers or students creating information. And this is kind of to everybody, so whoever wants to jump in.
I can just jump in quickly. Totally respect the need for academic research at the university level, but obviously at the city, we're really interested in applied research often. So certainly where there are opportunities to combine forces or align kind of areas of interest in the higher education research community with local problems, that's certainly something we're really interested in and potentially have the ability to partner with our state universities on.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was just going to mention real quick a little fun project we did with Dr. Montrose down at VSU and his students. We exposed them to a little bit of our crop residue burning program, and then they kind of took that and ran with it from their perspective and their social circles they run with. What would messages and what form of messages would resonate with their peers? So that was really neat, and I think that kind of stuff really needs to continue as well, and we hope to continue that relationship.
Great. I love hearing examples of things working well. So that's nice to hear too. Matt, do you want to go ahead?
So I think it starts with relationships, like I said, and of course I was speaking specifically to the legislature, but I like what Mark said, which is, and actually what the mayor and her team have done, which is really building relationships within the community and finding those other community leaders that can help bring people together to have the broader conversations. The other thing I would say is a academic report that's full of data often will leave a lot of room for interpretation to a layperson's eyes. And as you put that language and as you convert that language into something that has meaning for somebody with an associate's degree or with 4 years of college, but not in science. And things can be written to the advantage of whichever side is trying to present it. Even something as minimal to most of us as like a reliability score of 0.05, there's ways to write that to make it look as if it wasn't a very reliable assessment. And so what I think academics should do is, in addition to the APA scientific process document, they should work with like the Idaho Policy Institute and other groups to put out public-facing documents that are very well crafted and delivered to media stations with very little room for interpretation, I guess I would say.
Great, thank you. Jen, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I would like to say that the University of Idaho and their policy analysis group led by Dr. Dennis Becker has worked with us here at the University of Idaho to survey the Idaho private forest owners. And that data has really driven a lot of decisions that we have made here and opened up the opportunity for us to look deep into who those folks are, and so we can message appropriately and help build some really, like Matt said, some nicely crafted, digestible pieces of information that the public can utilize on their own and not fall into that trap of, ooh, I don't think that looks so right, or that doesn't look as, where they have to make those decisions for themselves. This was really data driven in how we look to ask the forest owners how we could do better as a state agency. And so on top of that, they helped us in multiple ways. And so this was a great relationship that we have with the University of Idaho, and the research and the policy and the actual practice on the ground, kind of a nice little triangle of work.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think it's what I'm kind of getting from this is we need more trusted relationships between all parties involved. We need transparency in terms of the information we're putting out and clarity on that information and making sure that it's put out in ways that different audiences can understand. So I think all of those are just really great takeaways from today. The other thing I've been thinking about, which is not in our canned questions that we came up with, but is, we have so much data and information on the front end. Like, we have a lot of information that we're putting out there, but it's really hard to measure the impacts of that data. Like, was it ever used? Or, like, for example, there are, hundreds of climate adaptation information tools that exist, or tons of tools looking at hazards online, but it's really hard to understand who's using that. Is it getting used? And so I guess I would just be curious to hear from you guys, like, what do you think are ways that we can start to understand how those things are being used, or any sort of practices we might put in place that better helps us better look at that? Maybe Jen, you can start since you
I was scribbling notes there. Honestly, if you could find a way to do that, I want to jump on board that plane, because counting widgets and assessing efficacy is that sweet golden spot that everyone wants, because they can say, oh, I did this and it gave me that. And so finding how to do that, and if that is an academic practitioner relationship that needs to happen, that would be the gap. I think that we've kind of kept talking around this, but ultimately that's where our gap is. Our gap is, we have this information, we put it on the ground, we gave it out to the public. Now, how is it used? Mm-hmm. Let's find that answer and see if it was working. So that would be my take on that, is somebody please help us with that portion of, we went down this path and let's see, did it work? And how do we measure that? Because a lot of those things are very subjective and they're not easy to put that pin in. We're not counting DBH on trees. Human social scientists have always been called the soft scientists, but it's a lot harder than you would think. And so nailing that down and putting a number to that and saying, more than anecdotal evidence, oh, I think it worked, or this was great and it's really working well. And then somebody goes, well, how do you know? Well, so giving us that little tool would be the thing that I would wish for on my Christmas list.
Thank you. Yeah. Does anyone else want to kind of follow up to that?
That and peace on earth, right? I'm sorry. I was going to say it's difficult, and I struggle a lot of times about having that question posed to me is, well, prove it. How do you know that works? Well, I've had conversations with a number of people, and I know this is integrating. It is getting into communities or getting into people's, but I can't measure it. I can't write it down and say X equals Y, right? And so that's I don't know. I struggle with even responding to that question yeah, let's find that answer, so yeah, let's find that answer maybe, Jennifer.
Carson, I want to jump in here because you opened this up a little bit, and something Mark just said, I really want to follow up on if anyone else has thoughts, which is that you really kind of identified the difference between, is it possible to measure whether we're having an impact and how we're measuring if we have an impact? And maybe if, you sort of talked a little bit about how you have a good sense that there's an impact happening, but you're not able to come up with a number maybe, or a metric that you can give to somebody else that proves it to them. And that's just something that I face so much in my work, which is at the interface of public land management agencies, data, and the public. And so that really spoke to me. And so I really want to hijack this and ask if anyone else experiences that in their position, that struggle between not just measuring the impact, but also finding ways to communicate it to somebody else that there was a measurable impact.
And that's particularly hard from a policymaking perspective. If you just take a look at the Snake River, the Twin Falls Snake River problems in regard to water pollution, the minute that you do that, you then have to look at what's causing the pollution. And when you start to look at that, you realize that there are a host of different things that are causing the pollution. There's non-point source pollution, which is essentially can't figure out, we know where it's coming from, but it's not coming from one specific source. There's point specific solution, like cities that have asphalt and fertilizer and storm runoff and everything else. And then there's point source pollution from like a flood or a sludge pit that overflows into the river. And so then you turn around and you say, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? And the minute that you do that, you inject all kinds of other human attributes with regard to engaging a community to find a solution, most of which revolve around that's going to impact me from an economic lens. And so you can't go to the dairyman and say, you are responsible for the pollution in the Snake River and we're going to fix you. And you can't go to the agricultural community and go, you're the non-point source pollution and we're going to fix you. And you can't go to the cities and say, you're the stormwater and we're going to fix you. You have to find a way through a change management theory and some pretty strong coordinated leadership to actually get everyone on board and bought into the idea that everyone is contributing to the problem and everyone will have to take a haircut to solve the problem. And that is the lift, right? You ask every farmer in the Treasure Valley how much the first freeze and the last freeze have changed over the last 20 years, and they will all say the first freeze is getting later and the final thaw is getting earlier, and this is problematic. But no one has really found a way to bring them together and address any possible solutions. And that's the kicker. And it's probably not scientists' responsibility. It's somebody else, but there needs to be an integration between the two.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to leave enough time for a couple audience questions. So I think I'm going to just cut off folks for now and get to a couple questions, then we can come back to it if folks have some more thoughts here. So we have a question from Greg Servine. So he said, the development and use of decision support systems seems applicable to this discussion. To what extent can those help or be applied?
There's a community model out there that's called deliberative decision making. And what it does is it tries to take what would be considered a wicked problem. And that could be anything from the pollution concept that I was talking about, problems with an airshed, and go through and really identify all of the pluses and minuses and the unanticipated consequences of potential solutions. Deliberative decision-making would be very beneficial in many of these complex problem environments. The challenge with deliberative decision-making is it takes a commitment from all of the players at the table. It takes a really long time, and it requires more than collaboration. or I'm sorry, it requires more than cooperation, which is people are willing to come to the table. It requires collaboration, which means people are willing to come to the table and potentially give something to get something.
Mm.
And it's really hard, but to that question, deliberative decision-making has produced really positive outcomes in community environments where a scientific or some other challenge was presented.
Does anyone else want to comment on that one? That was a great answer. All right, we have a question from Tom. And he says, question for the city reps, will the Boise foothills or front ever be seen as different ecological character from issues facing the Boise city proper? So I think that's for you, Steve.
That is for me. You know, I'm fortunate, Carson, to get out and speak broadly about the city's climate issues, but I'm also fortunate to be backed up by a team of experts who, in a lot of times, are probably better positioned to answer a question with that specificity. So I would suggest, Tom, if we can connect offline, I can get you in touch with our land management folks or fire. If that's the perspective, maybe given your earlier comment. I can say, just from a climate perspective and a research perspective, something I'm pretty excited about is we're currently working with, well, let me back up and say, I think we're a little light on data in terms of what opportunities for carbon sequestration are in the type of landscape habitat that we have here locally. And so we're working with some researchers over at Boise State to better quantify carbon sequestration in kind of the foothills plant and landscape that's there available. That can support twofold. One, we're already pretty active doing some restoration projects up there. So is there a potential for the city to account to that? And obviously we know we have some carbon sequestration and offset needs long-term. And then part two, is that potentially a driver for local partnerships with industry or with NGOs or others that are also interested in local climate solutions. But I'm glad to follow up with you offline on your specific question there and get you to the best folks to answer that.
Thanks, Steve. All right, other folks in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or continue to add it to the chat. You can raise your hand by clicking the reactions button and then hit the raise hand feature at the bottom. Brett, do you have any, in the meantime, if we're waiting, do you have any other things you want to check in on with folks? I know Matt has to leave a little bit early.
I do actually have something I want to talk about, but I'm going to give it maybe 15 more seconds just because I know people will get excited answering it, and then I'm worried won't leave time for anyone to ask any questions. But I guess I'll just throw it out there, you know, while people in the audience are formulating any questions, and you can feel free to be as brief on this as you want, but I noticed a couple of themes in the answers throughout this panel. One being about, you know, maybe data clarity and just, you know, the issues of translating data or interpretation of a data and how that can be skewed by maybe frames or politics. But the other thing that I heard a couple of people mention, and this is the one I really want to dig at a little bit, is this issue of localization. You know, a couple of you mentioned that the data is maybe just not local enough. Mark, you talked about how, you know, maybe the air clearing index is this, but not in this specific place. And, you know, how much of a barrier is that? You know, to the degree, what is the degree to which from a management perspective or, you know, are we sort of struggling to go from one scale that the data is at to maybe the scale that we are trying to make decisions, or maybe more aptly that people are sort of experiencing? And to what degree is that a potential barrier? And I guess I'll start with Mark if that's, or if he's got nothing to say, I can open it up.
And nothing to say. Oh, well, obviously it's a huge barrier. Because you can only get so granular on your data. And if you have to come up with some sort of a policy or regulation in order to implement something that you're using to protect the public from air pollution, you're looking for something that would be applicable throughout the entire state. And this state is so diverse in its topography and everything else that, you know, how do you come up with a solution like that? One of the big things I'll add to this, I don't even know if it addresses what you're asking, but how do you get information out to people when they need it, when they're trying to make that decision? And we're always thinking, gee, we'll go back to Matt's product, we'll send it out through a data bit, we'll text somebody. Well, that might work in some areas, but there's no coverage in other areas. So it's a big hurdle to get through. Did I talk around that enough?
No, I mean, you kind of took it in a different direction, but I think I was thinking about one scale when you're thinking of another one, which is I didn't even think of. So thank you. The temporal scale, it's one thing to have data in a convenient fashion, but if you need it at a specific time, that's a whole other barrier that I wasn't thinking about.
Some of these issues are just so big and heady that I really do think it's hard for people to see how they can do it and be effective in their local community. A good example is, for me personally, the city moved forward with a really good plan for the orange bag program, so that there was a way to kind of move plastics into an environment where maybe it could be reused through the diesel processing service, and the diesel system didn't work, and now there are orange bags. And so what do they do with that? And if you're my wife, she's like, these orange bags are a pain in my ass. I don't want to do them anymore. And I'm still like saving every little piece of plastic I can to put into the orange bags. And there's conflict there because, for the longest time, honestly, and I think I'm pretty in tune to the community, I still thought my orange bags were going to make diesel in Utah, until I saw a story about a big pile of orange bags making park benches, which I also think is a really good idea. But it's really, some of these things are really hard to get people to first wrap their head around on a global scale. Second, see how they're going to be able to actually make an impact at a local level. And three, all the best efforts and all the best ideas, sometimes they just don't work. And then how do you go back to a community that's wrapped their head around it and say, well, that didn't work? So it's really tough. I think it's really tough to engage locals on a local issue that you can then ratchet up with those Russian dolls that fit within each other, that you can ratchet up to the larger, global impacts. So I don't have a solution. Thoughts and prayers.
But, well, Matt, your example, you brought up something that I think is important, which is the other direction of communication and data. The orange bag example is interesting because the idea of turning that into diesel fuel is a great idea, except that they had incorrectly estimated how much contamination there would be in the orange bags. That was the holdup, right? And so in that example, you've identified that another potential data problem, which I think, Jen, you started thinking, asking about, do we know if things are working right? Clearly, there's a missing data coming from the other direction. We miscalculated how effectively people would use the orange bags, which meant that whole program sort of failed. And so I think it's a great example and a great point, and something, and I wonder about this communication going the other way. Do we have enough communication going the other way? We've got plenty of communication going one way, but how are we doing about reading the community?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess
sorry, y'all. I got
chime in.
Thank you.
Have to chime in there on behalf of our waste management folks. Certainly there have been some ups and downs in the program there, and I think some fair criticisms about communication of outcomes, but we are seeing pretty significant participation from the community still, and have a supporting environmental analysis kind of showing that the current outcomes of using those as an alternative fuel source are beneficial as opposed to landfilling. So just did want to chime in with those couple nuggets.
Thanks, Steve. And I know we have 1 minute left, so it's not really any time to answer more questions, but I would love to give everyone just like 30 seconds to say any last sentence or thing, or just give your contact information or things you want people to reach out about. So I will go ahead and start with Mark.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's been great dialogue, and hope to do it again sometime. If you do want to get a hold of me for anything, go to our website and find my email address, but it's Mark with a K .boyle at deq.idaho.gov.
Thanks, Mark. Jen.
I was just typing it into the chat, actually. I'm at Jennifer Russell at idl.idaho.gov, and I'm available to talk fire prevention and or fire adaptation with your community anytime. I really appreciate the invite, and thanks, Brett, for volunteering me to do this.
Thanks, Jen. And Steve, last thoughts.
Brett, Carson, thank you for the chance on behalf of the city to participate. Much appreciated. My email is shubble@cityofboise.org, or an internet search for Boise Climate Action will get you to us as well. There's a kind of a general inquiry mailbox there. Thanks again.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks again, Brett, for helping me co-facilitate. And I think this is a good starting discussion. Clearly, we need to have more of these kinds of conversations and continue to develop these relationships. So thanks so much for your time today. And next month, we'll be talking about supply chain resilience, which I think that kind of came up somewhat organically today. So I'm excited to continue talking about that next month. So thanks, everyone.
He was very interested in that, Carson.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Have a good week.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.